Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in our series Politics on Trial, I'm going to be talking about the trial of a queen, Mary, Queen of Scots. This is the story of the rivalry between two queens, Mary and Queen Elizabeth of England. But it's also the story about the rivalry between both of those queens and the English state, the men who claimed to represent the state, who were the servants of Queen Elizabeth, who thought their job was to protect Queen Elizabeth, but who also asserted the right of the state to judge a queen. It's a story of plots and conspiracies of the secret state and the workings of the secret state. And all of that was revealed at the trial of Mary, Queen of Scots as well. Mary, Queen of Scots was put on trial in October 1586, and she was executed just over 3 months later in February 1587. But that pair of events was the culmination of a much, much longer story. So this trial has a bigger and longer prehistory than any of the ones I've talked about so far. The trial of Thomas More was pretty drawn out. It's the end of a long story. But this was a 2 decades long story, at least. A 2 decades long story of rivalry between Elizabeth and Mary, dating back to 1567, when Mary was effectively driven out of Scotland, the place where she claimed to be the legitimate queen by her opponents, and had to throw herself on the mercy of her cousin Elizabeth in England. She hoped Elizabeth would support her in getting her throne back. Elizabeth didn't. Elizabeth effectively put her under house arrest and didn't really know what to do with her from that point, almost to the day that Mary was executed. Elizabeth was in a quandary about Mary. She saw that she was a threat, but at the same time she was extremely nervous at being seen to dispose of that threat because Mary was also a queen, and Elizabeth as a queen was very alive to the ways in which queens should not be judged like ordinary people. And at the same time, there was a nearly 2 decades long struggle between Elizabeth and the men whose job it was to serve her and to protect her in the name of the realm of England, but also in the name of the new Church of England, particularly her chief policy advisor, a man called William Cecil, and her private secretary, who was also effectively her spy master, the man who ran on her behalf a network across Europe of spies and double agents. His name was Francis Walsingham. And Cecil and Walsingham were convinced, effectively, that Elizabeth couldn't be safe while Mary, Queen of Scots, was alive, because Mary, Queen of Scots, was a magnet for all the different kinds of people across Catholic Europe who would like nothing better than to get rid of Elizabeth and to replace her with a Catholic monarch. Mary was their person. Plotters in France and in Spain and in the Vatican and in England, Catholics in England as well, who saw Mary as the way out of the nightmare of England under a queen who was the head of a church, the Church of England, which was no longer under the control of Rome and the Catholic Church. For Walsingham and for Cecil, Mary was just too dangerous, and they wanted to assert the authority of the English state that they represented in part, though not in the same way it was represented by their queen. They wanted to assert the authority of that state to deal with a threat like Mary, in the name of the Church of England, in the name of the Parliament of that state as well. And Elizabeth wouldn't allow it, because Elizabeth believed that to deal with Mary in that way, to put her on trial, to convict her, to execute her, even if it was done for Elizabeth's own safety, would be to assert the rights of men like Cecil and Walsingham over the rights of a queen. And so she resisted for nearly 2 decades their increasingly desperate attempts to deal with the problem of Mary by getting rid of her, but getting rid of her in a public way, in a formal way, through legal proceedings. Elizabeth would far rather someone simply assassinated Mary. Someone in the depths of the night snuck into her room and cut her throat. That would have been Elizabeth's ideal solution. Actually, the perfect solution for Elizabeth would simply have been that Mary died of natural causes, though no doubt everyone would have suspected that she'd been poisoned. That wasn't the problem for Elizabeth. If Mary needed to be got rid of, better it was private, better it looked like a kind of personal vendetta, because that was the kind of thing that happened to monarchs. They might fall foul of fate in one way or another, but if you formalize the proceedings, if you put a king or a queen on trial, one of the things Elizabeth thought you end up doing is putting kingship, monarchy, on trial, and that was incredibly dangerous. This struggle lasted from the first trial of Mary, Queen of Scots in England, which took place in 1568, though partly because Elizabeth didn't want Mary put on trial. She didn't want a queen on trial. It wasn't called a trial. It was called a conference. It was held in York. It was an assembly of nobles and peers who were to judge the question of whether or not Mary was guilty of involvement in the murder of her second husband. Mary had been married to a man called Lord Darnley, and the previous year he had been found dead. There had been an explosion in his apartments, but it wasn't the explosion that killed him. He seemed to have been strangled. And the person who was suspected of orchestrating this, a man called the Earl of Bothwell, not long after became Mary's third husband. It was a mess. It had intrigue written all over it. The suspicions that Mary had got rid of her second husband to marry her third were widespread. And the pressure to hold Mary to account for this in some way was very strong, particularly driven by men like Cecil and Walsingham. The conference that was held in York was shown a series of letters that it was claimed had been written by Mary. They were called the casket letters from Mary to Bothwell that implicated her in an attempt to murder her husband. There were endless arguments about whether they really were genuine or whether they'd been forged. Mary denied ever having written them. I think the consensus among historians now is that she didn't write them. They were forgeries. They were products of the secret state, the deep state, which did a lot of forging of documents. But that trial, which wasn't really a trial, also didn't really reach a verdict, because for Elizabeth, there was no good outcome of the conference, the proceedings against Mary in 1568. Were she to be convicted in some sense, held to account for having murdered her second husband, a queen would have been held to account by a court of, effectively, her lessers, mere peers of the realm. And that would have set a terrible precedent. Queens couldn't be treated in that way. At the same time, for Elizabeth, Mary couldn't be acquitted. She couldn't be sent back to Scotland as though she had done nothing wrong. It was a political trial, and as I talked about last time, one of the hallmarks of a political trial is if the person gets off, someone will say, we can't allow it to happen because now they're going to raise an army against us. Elizabeth was very conscious that Mary couldn't be allowed to get off, so she was stuck. This was a genuine double-edged sword. It's a bit like Thomas More's double-edged sword of the Act of Supremacy. He couldn't take the oath, he couldn't not take the oath. Either one imperiled him. Elizabeth thought guilty imperiled her if Mary was convicted, but any attempt to exonerate her also imperiled Elizabeth, because now her cousin, her rival claimant to the throne of England, would be empowered to pursue whatever means she needed to wreak her revenge, effectively. The difference between Elizabeth and Thomas More is that Thomas More had to make a choice. Elizabeth didn't. She was queen, and she made it clear that she didn't want either outcome. And so the conference finished with no verdict. Mary was neither exonerated nor was she convicted. The forged letters were passed around. Her reputation was not quite in tatters, but severely damaged. But nothing changed. Nothing changed about her status. She was still a legitimate queen, the Queen of Scots, on the run in England, having been driven out from her throne, in theory under the protection of her cousin, another queen, but also far too dangerous to be allowed out, so she had to be kept under control, effectively, under house arrest. And that situation did not change from 1568 right the way through to her trial in 1586. Elizabeth said that she recognised that Mary, as a captive queen, had the right to try and escape, in the sense that wouldn't any queen, any king who was driven out from their rightful throne and held somewhere else believe it was within their rights to do whatever they needed to do to get back? Elizabeth accepted that. Her spy master, her chief advisor, wanted to say, look, this woman is constantly plotting. She's plotting to get out. She's plotting to escape. And Elizabeth would say, that's okay. The thing she's not allowed to do is to plot to replace me. So she's not allowed to plot to become Queen of England. She is allowed to plot to be restored to the throne of Scotland. It's just we can't allow that to happen. Were she to be back on the throne of Scotland, she would be a serious threat to us. So we just have to hold her, and we have to fudge it, essentially. And then various possible solutions were floated. So one solution that could conceivably have worked would have been for Mary to marry again. Maybe she could be found an English husband, and that might neutralize the threat. But in the end, that didn't work for anyone. There was an attempt in the early 1570s, partly initiated by Mary, to find her an English husband, and the person who came into view was the Duke of Norfolk, perhaps the most powerful man in England, because the most powerful person in England was a woman, the Queen. And there was some thought that he and Mary might marry. But that didn't work for Elizabeth, because the Duke of Norfolk was far too powerful a man to be married to a woman who might well be part of a Catholic plot to replace Elizabeth. The Duke of Norfolk would happily have replaced Elizabeth with a Catholic queen, especially if he were her husband, because then in his own mind he would effectively be king. So it was much too dangerous for Elizabeth to let Norfolk have his way, but it was also no good for Mary, because to be married again would be to put herself effectively in the power of her husband. Norfolk would be the power in the land. And Mary didn't want that any more than Elizabeth did. They were both fighting for the rights of monarchy. They called themselves princes and kings, effectively. They didn't think there was a distinction between a queen and a king. These were the rightful monarchical rulers of their lands. But they were both queens. And as queens, they knew they were much more vulnerable. A queen who marries is subject to the authority of her husband. That, after all, is why Elizabeth never married. And in never marrying, Elizabeth did the thing that made her state vulnerable, because she did not have a natural successor. She had no children. As the Virgin Queen, everyone knew that on her death there was the potential of the collapse of the order that she had established. The thing that Henry, her father, thought was the precondition of monarchy, which is to produce a son, was the thing that Elizabeth had deliberately chosen not to do, not even to attempt. And she did it because she knew that her power depended on her authority as the only rightful ruler of England. A husband would have complicated that. Mary knew it too. Mary, by this point, had been married 3 times. The idea of a 4th husband as the way out of her dilemma was deeply unappealing. A man who was too weak to dominate her was too weak to free her. A man who was powerful enough to free her, like Norfolk, was too powerful for her, because he would have tried to be king. In the end, Norfolk was implicated in a plot to free Mary and to replace Elizabeth on the throne of England. And though Mary was not charged, Norfolk was. He was tried, and reluctantly, Elizabeth had him executed. Reluctantly, because to execute such a powerful man was dangerous for a woman on the throne of England. And so nothing changed. Mary was still captive. She didn't have a new husband, and Elizabeth didn't know what to do with her, and Elizabeth's advisors wanted to make sure that Mary was out of the way. What they needed was a clear plot, not a marriage plot, but an actual assassination plot, an invasion plot, a good old-fashioned conspiracy. And in 1583 they got one. It was called the Throckmorton Plot, or conspiracy. It was a plan to assassinate Elizabeth, to encourage a French invasion of England, and to put Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne of England. The people who were involved in the plot were caught. Much of the plot had been known about because Walsingham was a pretty experienced spy master by this point, and he had eyes and ears everywhere. Secret codes had long since been decoded. Ciphers were deciphered. Servants had been bought off. People who worked in embassies were playing a double game. There were spies everywhere. Elizabeth, Mary, they all knew there were spies everywhere. Mary didn't really trust anyone. But in the end, the plot was exposed. Mary was implicated in it. And Walsingham and Cecil thought this was their opportunity to get rid of Mary. But Elizabeth wouldn't allow it. What was decided instead was for Parliament to enact new legislation for the safety of the Queen, an act for the safety of the Queen, which drew up new rules to protect the Queen from just these kinds of plots, and that said that in future anyone implicated in such a plot, by implication even if that person is a queen, would be put on trial. But also something called the Bond of Association was drawn up, and all of the leading figures in England were required to sign it. And it committed them to track down and murder anyone who was involved in an attempt to assassinate the Queen. And Mary was required to sign the Bond of Association. So after the plot to assassinate the Queen, in which she was implicated, she was forced to sign a document in which, at least ostensibly, she pledged, next time that happened, to hunt down and kill the people responsible. But that also allowed, in Elizabeth's eyes, the ideal solution, which is next time this happens, if Mary is implicated, and everyone knew she would be implicated, now there were a whole host of people, ironically including Mary herself, who were committed to hunt down and kill everyone involved in the conspiracy, and that could include the beneficiary of the conspiracy. They would be legitimately entitled to murder Mary, Queen of Scots. And Elizabeth would far rather that Mary were murdered in that way than that she was put on trial and charged with treason and executed. So the situation was still unresolved, but then something happened which completely changed the dynamic, the calculus of all those involved about where the risk really lay. And the change took place in Scotland. Scotland, over this period, had had a king, but he had, to start with, when Mary was driven out, been just a baby. Mary's son, James VI of Scotland. And the people who wanted him to ruled through various kinds of regency arrangements because he was just a child. But by the middle of the 1580s, he was no longer a child. And when he reached the age of 18, after his own dramas, he had been captured and held prisoner, but he escaped, he declared himself in his own right King of Scotland. And he offered to his mother, who was captive in England, the role of Queen Mother. He wrote to her and said, "We can't rule together. I am now the rightful king of this land. I am no longer a child. There is no longer to be a regency. You are not to claim to rule this country. It's mine. But I will honour you. You are my mother. You are the Queen Mother." And she was absolutely outraged. This, for her, in some ways, was the ultimate betrayal. Her son, whom she didn't know, they'd been living in separate countries for all of his life, her son had basically cut her out. And the reason that changed everything is that the possibility that Mary might become once again Queen of Scots, or maybe rule jointly with her son, was her great bargaining chip. That is, in England, she could say there might be some arrangement in which I return to Scotland as Queen, and then the Queen of England and the Queen of Scotland can come to an understanding which is mutually beneficial, which ensures both of our safety. I am not trying to take the Queen of England's throne. I'm not interested in the throne of England. I want to be returned to Scotland. But once her son had taken the throne of Scotland from her, effectively, she no longer could say that. Now, if Elizabeth was going to do a deal with whoever sat on the throne of Scotland, and eventually she did do a deal, indeed it was a deal that ultimately allowed James VI to become James I of England, it would be with Mary's son, not with Mary. And as soon as James stepped forward and made himself the King of Scotland, all of the focus of people around Europe shifted. Now there was a man on the throne of Scotland, a young man, a man who would presumably have heirs. Everything depended on making sure you had the right relationship with him For all of these people, the conspirators, the plotters, Elizabeth, the people around Elizabeth, everybody wanted to make sure they were in the right place in relation to James. Mary was no longer relevant, which meant that if Mary was going to escape and restore her rightful status, now it was clear to almost everybody that this was probably going to have to be as Queen of England. And so the plots resumed, and Mary encouraged the plots to resume, but they were more reckless, the plots now. They were more desperate. She was increasingly clear on her own mind that the only way out of her predicament was to get rid of Elizabeth. She could, of course, have tried to get rid of her son, but even Mary, I think, would have had second thoughts about that. There was another conspiracy uncovered in 1586, and this was the one that finally allowed Cecil and Walsingham to put Mary on trial, because this time they were absolutely determined that they would have evidence against her in her own hand and in her own name. The trouble to this point, though there had been forgeries and letters and attempts to blacken her name and to implicate her in these plots, was nothing was quite ever sure enough or good enough to persuade Elizabeth that enough was enough and now was the time to make an example of her cousin. After the Babington plot in 1586, which was basically a setup, Walsingham and Cecil by this point were determined that once they got wind of a plot, they would make sure that they had bought off the right people and turned the right people and had access to the right codes and forged the right documents, that they would encourage the plot to the point where Mary committed herself to it. They would have evidence of it, and only then would they blow the whistle on it. And that's effectively what happened. And they thought that they had the crucial piece of evidence that they needed because, first of all, they had a letter from Babington to Mary in which he said that 6 men would come and free her, and these 6 men would be involved in an assassination plot against Elizabeth. And they had a letter from Mary back in her own hand, effectively saying Godspeed to the work of the 6 gentlemen. The number 6 was the link. 6 people would free her, and Mary acknowledged knowledge of those 6 and therefore of the plot. That was at least thought to be enough. It wasn't quite enough, and it was embellished with further forgeries, which then were exposed, letters that were enciphered, deciphered, and then put back in a code to make it look like the spy master hadn't had access to them. Servants were secured to testify against Mary. A whole paraphernalia of evidence was built up. But the key thing that they needed, that they thought they needed to persuade even Elizabeth to allow this to go to trial, was evidence in Mary's own hand, and they thought they had it. And so finally, even Elizabeth was persuaded that Mary should stand trial. And under the terms of the Act for the Safety of the Queen, someone who is involved in a conspiracy to assassinate the Queen would be put on trial before a court convened of privy councillors and peers of the realm. Not specified who the person on trial might be, but that bypassed what Mary always claimed, which was a queen, if she was to be tried by her peers, could only be tried by fellow monarchs, which was never going to happen. You couldn't assemble enough fellow monarchs. Most of the monarchs of Europe were on Mary's side. Elizabeth was isolated. The Act simply specified that anyone involved, of whatever status, low or high, would face this kind of tribunal. So such a tribunal was convened. I think it was 47 peers and privy councillors were written to and told to attend Fotheringay Castle, which is in Northamptonshire, in October 1586, to try Mary, Queen of Scots, for treason. And of the 47 invited, 40 showed up. 7 made their excuses or didn't get the letter or happened to be out of the country at the time, because it was not at all clear exactly what would be required of them. I mean, I think everyone suspected that they were this time going to have to return a guilty verdict. But would Elizabeth be happy with them if they did that? Or having been bullied into these proceedings, would she be furious with the men who basically presumed to take down a queen? 40 of them showed up. Also in attendance were Cecil and Walsingham. So the 2 men who had spent the best part of 2 decades trying to engineer this scenario were there to make sure that this time Mary didn't get off. This was a trial, so Mary was able to defend herself. and she did defend herself. She made a series of powerful statements in her own defense. In her case, I think there were essentially two lines that she took, two lines of defense that she tried to deploy in this trial. The first was the familiar one, the one that is not by any means unique to monarchs, queens, often tried by people who think they are on trial in a court that doesn't have the jurisdiction to hold them to account because the court is beneath them. She refused to recognize the authority of the court. She had, it is true, signed the bond of association, but she was not party to the act, the parliamentary act that initiated these proceedings, and she refused to accept these proceedings. She said in this court that she would only accept a trial before Parliament itself. So she couldn't say, I want to be tried by a jury of monarchs, because that didn't make sense. So she said the only place that could legitimately ask her these questions about her complicity or not in the plot was a full assembly of the Parliament of England. There's something a little odd about this because it was the Parliament of England that had put into law the Act for the Safety of the Queen, which was the act under which Mary was being tried. The Parliament of England at this time had showed itself to be very, very willing to do the bidding of Elizabeth, whatever that bidding was, and indeed the bidding of Elizabeth's servants, her public servants, her civil servants. So why did Mary think she would get a fairer hearing before a Parliament that had more or less said, on the record, Mary should die, than she would before this court? My guess is that she suspected, in a sense it's not a real argument because she knows she's not going to get to appear before Parliament, but if she had to defend it beyond merely asserting that that's the only legitimate court, I think she might say pragmatically that she knew, as well as Elizabeth knew, that there was a difference between a Parliament theoretically enacting legislation that might result in the execution of a queen, and Parliament itself condemning a queen to execution, given they would be doing it in the name of another queen. And I think Mary thought that to appear as a queen before Parliament would have given Parliament pause about what it means to do the Queen's bidding, given they would have known how reluctant Elizabeth was to see queens hauled before Parliament. That probably was the logic, but it wasn't going anywhere because by that point, there was no way out for Mary. This was the trial, these were the proceedings, and they would reach a conclusion. She knew that. So that meant the other line of defence had to relate to the evidence itself. And Mary spoke to the assembled privy councillors and peers and said, this is tittle-tattle. The evidence that's been assembled against me, like all the evidence that's ever assembled against me in all of the various attempts to blacken my name, is a mixture of gossip and forgery and the testimony of servants. And she said to these peers and privy councillors, what security would there be for any of us, effectively, though she wouldn't quite put it like that because they weren't quite like her, but she knew what she was doing. All of these men would themselves have had retinues of servants. They would all have had their little mini courts of their households. How safe is anyone in this world if they can be condemned by the testimony of their servants? We all know servants lie. We all know servants gossip. We all know servants can be bought off and turned by men like Walsingham. And Walsingham had his servants too. What safety is there in this world if a woman like me, a queen like me, can be condemned on the testimony of servants? So she appealed to their own sense that there was a hierarchy, not quite a hierarchy that reached all the way up to her, because she was in her own mind above them, but enough of a hierarchy that no one of their status could feel safe in a world where you can lose your life because your servants have gossiped about you. And that meant the crucial evidence was the evidence in her own hand. That was the thing on which the trial would turn, in the sense that that was the thing that Cecil and Walsingham thought went beyond the argument that this is servants' testimony. And there, Mary's defence about that piece of evidence is simply that it wasn't conclusive, because the one thing she had been very careful, though she wouldn't have said it like this, not to say is those 6 men. That is, to specify that she was talking about the same 6 men that Babington was talking about. He wrote to her, 6 men are going to free you. Elizabeth is finished. And she wrote back, Godspeed the 6 men. And she said, there is nothing that says that I encouraged those 6 men or was part of a plot involving those 6 men. You cannot connect these 2 documents because there is nothing from me in my hand saying that I was talking about the same thing. So on the one hand, that is a pretty terrible line of defense, and presumably even Mary knew it wasn't going to work. But it allowed her to assert what she believed was the key part of her defense, which is that as a queen, of course, she was entitled to communicate with people in the outside world as one of the most important public figures in Europe. And as Elizabeth had acknowledged for the best part of 2 decades, some of that communication would come in the form of attempts to liberate herself from her predicament. And in attempting to liberate herself from her predicament as a public person, she would say things that could not be construed to be evidence of conspiracy or a plan to assassinate Elizabeth, but merely as evidence of her impatience with her situation. As a private person, that is, as an individual, she had said nothing that suggested that she, Mary, Queen of Scots, the person who had been held captive in England, that person knew what this plot was about. There was a public persona who was engaged in general communications around broad themes of liberation. And then there was a human being, Mary, who had never said or done anything that suggested that in her own mind was knowledge of the plot. Again, as a line of defense, I'm not sure anyone in that courtroom was likely to be persuaded by it. But it did allow her to do something which in these trials is probably the best that the doomed defendant can hope for, which is to show up the hypocrisy of her accusers, because she did turn on Cecil in the courtroom and she called him out for his betrayals of her status, for his conniving with Walsingham over forgeries. If she was accused of plotting, he was at least as much of a plotter as she was. In fact, all of the plotting that had gone on around her, had been encouraged by these men. They were trying to entrap her. They were the conspirators. And she goaded him sufficiently that in the court, Cecil spoke in his own defence. And he said back to Mary, to her face, I quote, "As a private person, I have done nothing unbeseeming an honest man, nor, as I bear the place of a public person, have I done anything unworthy of that place." In other words, as a public person, certain things are required of me. And the suggestion here is those things that are required of someone as a public person might not be entirely consistent with the morals and standards that would be upheld by a private person. Yes, he had to do things that, seen in a different light, might be a little unseemly, but for God's sake, his responsibility is the safety of the Queen, and he has to do whatever is necessary for that. But as a private person, effectively, in his own mind and in his own heart, he's never done anything wrong. And how dare Mary presume to know the private person behind the public person? To which Mary could say, touché, and vice versa. You say, I cannot know you, you cannot know me. And I'm a queen, for God's sake. You're just a servant. That was her most powerful line of defense. And it didn't work, because she was always going to be convicted once that proceedings had been established. Everybody knew that. And she was indeed found guilty. And she was condemned to death, which was the punishment for treason. There was no leeway. And then the drama reverted to a different drama. In the courtroom, the confrontation, the face-off was between these men who had been trying to do this to Mary for 18 years, to have her convicted in an English court, and Mary. That was the drama, the courtroom drama. And then when it finished, the drama resumed between Elizabeth and those men. They wanted her to confirm the sentence of death. And Elizabeth was deeply reluctant to do it. She was deeply reluctant to acknowledge that this court had that authority to kill that queen. However useful it would be for her for that queen to be gone, she didn't want her gone in that way. And she made it clear that of these two routes to get rid of Mary after the Babington plot had been uncovered, the one through the Act for the Safety of the Queen, which required a trial, and the Bond of Association, which merely required of the people who had signed it to track the woman down and kill her, Elizabeth much preferred the second. Could someone not come along and do what they were required to do under the bond, which was find a way to poison Mary, get into the place where she's being held? Indeed, couldn't her captors, the men who were responsible for her captivity, find a way to kill her? And Elizabeth made it completely clear that she would wait and allow that other course to take place, but nobody would do it. Even the people who knew it was the Queen's bidding, the Queen's wish, because no private person who killed a queen could ever feel entirely safe, even if they were doing it for a queen, because a queen might change her mind about how they felt about the killing of a queen once a queen was dead. Nobody would do it, and it wasn't for want of trying or asking. This is the drama that forms the basis for the play about Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots, Schiller's Maria Stuart. The drama is the drama after the trial, after the sentence has been passed, around the question of whether or not Elizabeth will allow it to come to pass. And in Maria Stuart, the drama between Mary and Elizabeth is over that question, Mary's appeal to Elizabeth after conviction, knowing how reluctant Elizabeth was to see the sentence carried out. In the play, the two women meet. They never did meet. And 3.5 months later, even Elizabeth couldn't hold out anymore. And the sentence was carried out. And then the final part of the drama took place. And this is closer to some of the stories I've already talked about in this series. The moment when death was assured and the convicted person can, as it were, speak their mind. And in Mary's case, once it was clear that she was going to be executed, she put her affairs in order so that history would remember her as a certain kind of person. Throughout her life, her relationship to Catholicism had been complicated because in trying to rule Scotland, to be Queen of Scotland, she knew she was on the throne of a country which was divided on the question of Catholicism. And she herself often gave indications that she was not straightforwardly on one side rather than another. But when it came to her death, she was going to die as a Catholic martyr. And that is what she was determined to do. She wrote letters about her faith, her lifelong Catholic faith. She made it clear that she understood she was being persecuted as a Catholic. She went to her beheading dressed in russet brown, the colour of the blood of martyrs. In the minutes before her execution, she prayed in Latin. She refused to be lectured by the representative of the Church of England who had been sent to give her a sermon explaining to her exactly why this fate had befallen her. She mocked and belittled that person. She was determined to be executed as a Catholic queen. Until that point, her way out was not to stand on ceremony as a Catholic queen because she had to fudge that question. It was her Catholicism that drew the conspirators around her. And in order to distance herself from those conspirators, she couldn't do what she did once she knew her death was imminent. So at that point, just before there was no escape, she revealed herself for who she really was. But in her own way, actually, she reinvented herself as someone she never really was. She never quite was that Catholic martyr until the point where that was the only role left for her. And that's what Schiller dramatizes. The execution was a grim, grisly business. It took 3 blows of the executioner's axe to remove her head. When her head had been removed, the executioner lifted it up, and because she was wearing a wig, he found himself just holding the wig, and her skull bounced across the platform, squalid, miserable, horrific. a reminder that however you try and contrive your final performance, in the end, past a certain point, it is out of your hands. But it worked in the sense that Mary did increasingly come to be remembered in the way she wished to be remembered. Her performance, not at her trial, but at her execution, defined her image. But there's something else to say about the trial and not the execution. And in a way, this is the thing that most fascinates me about the trial as a trial. It was a show trial in the sense that the men who orchestrated it had reached a point where they were not going to allow any other outcome. That's why they were in the room. That's why they were there, to make sure everybody knew what was expected of them. Yes, Mary would be allowed to speak. Yes, there would be a record of what she said. Yes, she might try and persuade those 40 men in judgment over her that they should not condemn her to death. But those 40 men knew what they had to do, and presumably the 7 who didn't show up were the ones who might have been waverers. But the ones who were there, by the time you'd arrived at Fotheringay Castle, you couldn't have been in any doubt about the outcome of these proceedings. So it was a show trial in which Mary's defence was just a performance. It was an attempt not to get off, not to achieve some other outcome. Mary knew that depended on Elizabeth, and Elizabeth wasn't there. So whatever happened in these proceedings, it would be Mary speaking to Elizabeth through both the medium of the trial and what happened afterwards. So in a way, the person that Mary was speaking to in making these defences, these people have no right to try me. I should be appearing before Parliament. That is where a queen belongs, knowing that Elizabeth would think a queen does not belong before Parliament. These people are condemning me out of the mouths of servants. Can anyone be safe? Can a queen be safe when servants can turn against them and then be believed in a court of law? In lots of ways, all of that was being spoken to Elizabeth. It would be communicated to Elizabeth. She hoped that Elizabeth would be unable to sign her death warrant, and she nearly succeeded. Elizabeth did it long enough in the hope that someone else would do the dirty work, but still, it was clear that Mary was right, that the one person who could conceivably save her was Elizabeth. She had absolutely no hopes that her son would save her. In those letters that she wrote the night before she died, when she knew she would die the next morning, she wrote about her son. And in a way, the only person she couldn't forgive at the end, really couldn't forgive, was her son. She wrote to one relative, I quote, "Concerning my son," that is James VI and future James I of England, "concerning my son, I commend him to you as much as he deserves, as I cannot answer for him." She disowned her son, not least because she knew by that point that her son might be going to achieve the thing that she never was able to achieve, which was an understanding with Elizabeth about the succession that put the King of Scots on the throne of England. So Elizabeth could conceivably save Mary, her son wouldn't, and she disowned him. The people who certainly were not going to save her were the 40 men who had her life in their hands. It was completely clear that all 40 of them would vote to convict her, but they didn't. 39 of them did, and one, a man called Lord Zouche, about whom not a great deal is known, who was a young man at the time. He was one of those who had been summoned, one of those peers, and he appeared at the trial. And when it came to the vote, it was 39-1. It is not recorded on what basis he refused to convict. So it could be that he was persuaded by her arguments. I think that's unlikely. It's possible that he calculated that it wasn't completely clear that a conviction was what Elizabeth wanted. It was completely clear that a conviction was what Cecil and Walsingham and all of the servants of the secret state wanted. They wanted their day in court so that they could assert their power in this realm. But maybe Elizabeth didn't want that, and maybe Zouche was the only one who thought that calculation actually was one in his own interest to make. But if so, it's unbelievably reckless. I mean, brave is one word for it, but I think foolish is another word for it. The risk, the downside of being the one person who votes not to convict Mary, Queen of Scots, is surely that the people who will come for you next are Walsingham and Cecil. I mean, those are the really dangerous men in the room. Yes, Elizabeth is dangerous, but she's not there. They're there. They're watching you. I'm assuming as the proceedings took place, they were scanning the 40 men just to make sure that there were no waverers. And this man wavered. He didn't just waver, he went the other way. He was the one holdout, and he didn't persuade any of them to come with him. Did he even try? I presume not. He did this weird private thing. And history does not record why, it just records that. It wasn't completely unanimous. It was 39-1. So what happened to Lord Zouche, who did this brave, reckless thing? Nothing happened to him. In fact, he prospered. There is no evidence that there was any retribution. There is no evidence that there were any consequences for him at all. His career, seen from the outside, just seamlessly progresses through 1586, 1587, on to 1588, 1589. He was summoned again for another treason trial, this time of the Earl of Arundel, and that time he convicted. So maybe what changed was he thought, I can't get away with this twice, or maybe that time round he thought that the correct verdict was for that man to be sentenced to death. In that case, it was after the Spanish Armada, and one of the things that Arundel was accused of was of praying for the success of the Armada, which seems like a looser charge than plotting to assassinate the Queen and writing a letter saying, yeah, those 6 men, let's hope they do their work. But Lord Zouche, he was happy to go along with conviction in that case, and he continued to prosper. He got roles at court, ambassadorial roles, business roles. He was involved in the very beginnings of the colonization of the United States. He was allowed to continue private life, family life, and he died in his bed, like Richard Rich. Richard Rich died in his bed despite the fact that he was a perjurer and a monster. Lord Zouche, in the case of the trial of Mary, Queen of Scots, was the opposite of Richard Rich. He was the only one in the trial who didn't do what was expected of him by the powerful men who were controlling proceedings. And like Richard Rich, he also prospered and survived. And it does raise that question in a show trial, what is the meaning of symbolic, ineffectual dissent? I found myself thinking, is 39-1 less of a show or more of a show than 40-0? 40-0, it's clear what's gone on. There was no way out. 39-1, it's equally clear what's gone on. There was still no way out. One person, it's nothing like the trial of Socrates, where Socrates was able to say afterwards, well, if 30 people had swung out of the 500, I would have got off. I don't think Mary, Queen of Scots found herself thinking, if only there were another 20 Lord Zouches, because there just weren't. There wasn't even another one Lord Zouche. In some ways, 39-1 looks even more of a fix. It's like, we know 40-0 looks not great. So it's a bit like those elections under totalitarian regimes where the winning candidate gets 99%. And the question is always, who were the 1% who voted against? And one assumption is often that the regime is quite happy with 1% to vote against, because in their own mind they think, well, that shows it wasn't fixed, whereas in the eyes of the world, it shows it was completely fixed. It's not hard to imagine some kind of conspiratorial interpretation of what went on there. This was a trial, not a secret trial, but a trial of the Elizabethan secret state, the one that had been plotting to get rid of Mary, Queen of Scots for 2 decades and finally got its way, and it was going to make sure the machinery worked. When forgeries were exposed, it withdrew them, and other documents were supplied. The witnesses were not just tampered with, they knew absolutely what they had to do. No one was in any doubt about what had to be done. Is it plausible that Lord Zouche also didn't know what his role was? A young man in the world of Queen Elizabeth thought, I'll take a chance with my conscience here? Or was he too part of that conspiracy that Mary accused Walsingham and Cecil of setting up? This whole trial is a conspiracy. This is what the person who is on trial in a show trial can say. I'm not the conspirators. You are the conspirators because you have contrived this entire event. Mary couldn't say that in court because Lord Zouch's choice was only known at the end of proceedings. But it is, I think, consistent with what she said. To me, at least, though I would love to ask him, to me at least, 39-1, the heroic stance of the obscure Lord Zouch, makes it more, not less of a fix. But I may be wrong about that. Maybe, and it could happen in any trial, under any circumstances, someone, though knowing what was expected of him, did something heroic and surprising. It's possible. It's possible. I have to say, I doubt it. Last year, as part of the series that we did about great political fictions, I did record an episode about the play I discussed in today's episode, Schiller's great drama Maria Stuart, which tells the story of the run-up to the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. If you'd like to hear that, we'll put the link in our show description, or you can find it on our website, like you can find all of our episodes, ppfideas.com. Thank you so much to everybody who has written in suggesting other political trials that we could do in this series. We had quite a long list already, and now it's got quite a lot longer. Everything from John Brown to Bataclan and much else besides. We're going to be doing this series of political trials in chunks so that we don't all drown in political trials. And we'll be doing some other things in between, starting next time in our regular slot when we have an anniversary episode. It will be, to the day, the 50th anniversary of Britain's Europe Referendum, not the 2016 Brexit referendum, but the 1975 referendum that confirmed Britain's membership of the European Community. And I'm going to be talking to our regular PPF contributor Robert Saunders about that referendum. Robert wrote the definitive history of it, but also about 2016 and what both referendums can tell us about Britain's relationship with Europe today. We'll also be having some more history of bad ideas coming very soon. But first, next time, Robert Saunders on 1975, 2016 and now. Do join us for all of that. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.